The ticking of the wall clock was too loud. Not the soft, background kind, but sharp, deliberate ticks that landed in the silence like a metronome no one could turn off. The room was dim, the heavy curtains drawn tight, cutting out the winter sun. A single brass lamp cast a pool of amber light over the long oak table, its polished surface reflecting shapes distorted by the grain of the wood. The air smelled faintly of paper, old ink, and the kind of dust that clings to places where decisions outlive the people who make them. My father leaned back in his chair, ankle resting over one knee, one hand draped lazily over the armrest. His fingers tapped in a slow, steady rhythm, the rhythm of a man who already knows the outcome. My aunt sat rigid, arms locked tight across her chest, her gaze fixed on the far wall, as though if she didn't look at me, I wouldn't exist. Beside her, my uncle stared down at a blank legal pad, clicking his pen once, twice, then again, the only marks on the page a crooked line drawn right through the center. And across the table, my cousin, younger than me by 3 years, dressed too sharply for a family meeting. The corner of his mouth tilted upward in that small, cutting smirk, the one that says, "I told you so," without a single word. The lawyer cleared his throat. His voice was calm, professional, almost bored, as he read line after line of the will. Property, shares, accounts, names, numbers, signatures, all belonging to someone else. Then the page turned, and the final sentence dropped like a blade. No provision is made for Eliot Tran. For a moment, nothing moved. I heard the faint creak of leather as my father shifted in his seat, the metallic clink of my aunt's bracelet sliding against the table. My cousin's smirk deepening, the verdict, to him, a personal victory. I didn't argue. I didn't speak. I didn't even blink, because while they thought I had nothing, I already knew something they didn't. The lawyer's voice kept reading, but my mind had already stepped out of that room. It went back to a smaller one, a kitchen that smelled of jasmine tea and steamed rice, with lace curtains swaying in the summer air. I was 12 the day my father told me at a crowded family dinner that I was wasting my time not working at the company. I remember staring down at my bowl, cheeks hot, trying to disappear into the chair. Then Grandma's voice cut in calm, but firm enough to still every fork at the table. Not every path worth walking has to start in your office. She didn't look at him when she said it. She looked at me. When I moved to the city years later, chasing design contracts that barely paid rent, I got an envelope in the mail. No return address, just my name in her slanted handwriting. Inside was cash for the month and a single line on a folded note. "You keep building, I'll keep watching." She never once asked how much I made, only what I was making. One night over tea, she told me how she started Tran Tea with nothing but 2 tins of leaves and a borrowed kettle. Everyone said a woman couldn't run a business alone. She just smiled and poured the next cup. That night, she handed me my cup and said, "Tra la di stroke letter 1 EC3 chia s letter 1 EBB. Kong PH letter 1 EA3 ID stroke letter 1 EC3 Bon R letter 1 EBB Dan D letter 1 EF1. Remember that, Eliot." I did. And as I sat there in Whittaker and Lee's office, their eyes full of pity or quiet triumph, I realized something. She hadn't left me out of the will because she forgot me. She left me something they didn't even know existed. The sound of a pen clicking snapped me back to the present. The will was finished. The page lay flat on the table, and the lawyer's voice was done carrying my name because it never had. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker. My father pushed his chair back just far enough to cross his arms. My aunt adjusted her scarf, not to keep warm, but to avoid looking at me. My uncle stacked his papers like there was suddenly somewhere more important he needed to be. "Mr. Tran," the lawyer said, his tone purely procedural, "you are entitled to personal effects from your grandmother's apartment. Here's the key." A small brass key slid across the table toward me. The metal caught the lamplight for a moment before coming to rest against my hand. That was it. No condolences, no acknowledgement, just a polite handoff, as though I was there to pick up a forgotten umbrella, not the last pieces of the only person in this family who'd ever believed in me. I took the key without a word. My father's eyes followed me as I stood. My cousin didn't even bother hiding his smirk. The oak door closed behind me with a solid, final sound. I didn't look back, because whatever they thought they had won in that room, they'd already lost something far more important. The lock turned with a hollow click I'd heard 100 times as a kid. The door opened to the same narrow hallway I used to race down in socked feet, straight into the warmth of her kitchen. The air hit me first, jasmine tea, faint but still there, woven into the grain of the wooden cabinets. Underneath it, cedar from the old wardrobe in her bedroom. It was a scent I'd carried with me through college, through every apartment after, like it had followed me on purpose. Sunlight spilled through the lace curtains, softening the sharp edges of winter outside. The rug in the living room still had the worn patch near the armchair where her heels always rested. The porcelain teapot with the hairline crack sat exactly where it always had, on a tray by the stove. I set my bag down and just stood there. It was quiet, not empty, but quiet in a way that felt like she had just stepped out for a moment and might walk back in at any second. I started with the shelves in the living room. Books stacked too deep, some with receipts and handwritten notes tucked inside. Sweaters folded in the hall closet, still carrying the faint perfume she wore when she visited the shop. Then the small things, recipe cards, a chipped mug I'd given her at 16, photo albums stacked in uneven piles. Each page was another piece of the life she'd built, and each one slowed me down more than it should have. That's when I opened the cabinet above the counter, the one she always said was just for cookbooks. Behind the last stack of worn, flour-dusted spines, something caught my eye. An old wooden shoebox, no label, no lock. Just the lid, slightly warped from years of being opened and closed. Inside, photographs, curling at the edges, their colors leaning toward sepia. Family portraits stiff with formal smiles. Summer picnics by the lake. Holiday dinners where the light looked warmer than it ever felt in real life. I was halfway through the stack when I saw it, a picture with a strip of yellowed tape pressed tight across one corner. Grandma was never the type to repair a photo like that. If it was torn, she'd replace it. If it was stained, she'd reprint it. I turned it over. My fingernail caught the edge of the tape, peeling it back slowly. The brittle paper crackled in protest. Beneath it was metal, a small brass key, flat and warm against my palm, a number engraved into one side. Not the kind for a front door. The kind that opened something you weren't supposed to find. The key sat in my palm, warmer now from my skin, its weight strangely heavy for something so small. The number etched into it was neat, almost perfect, not scratched by accident, but engraved with intent. I checked the kitchen drawers first, though I knew it wouldn't be that easy. Nothing but spoons, rubber bands, and a drawer full of menus from restaurants that had probably closed years ago. In the bedroom, I crouched to look under the bed. Dust and the edge of an old shoebox, but no lock. I opened the wardrobe, shifting coats aside, cedar-scented fabric brushing against my hands, but still, nothing that fit. Then I noticed the other wardrobe. The heavy one against the far wall, the one I remembered two movers grunting over when they'd brought it in. It had always seemed just a little too perfectly placed, like it wasn't there for convenience, but for coverage. I gripped the side and pulled. The first inch was the hardest, wood dragging across the floor, the low groan of weight being shifted after years in the same spot. Dust rose in the thin beam of light from the window. Behind it, flush with the wall, was a small steel door, the paint around its edges just slightly fresher than the rest. My pulse picked up. I slid the brass key into the lock. For a second, I was afraid it wouldn't turn, that maybe I was just reading too much into an old photo and a hidden key. But then, a soft click. The door swung open on hinges that barely made a sound. Inside was a neat stack, a thick envelope sealed with wax, a bundle of documents tied with ribbon, and at the very back a leather folder, its surface smooth, embossed with gold lettering that caught the light. Tran Tea Co. Trademark registration and ownership rights. I reached for it, the leather cool under my fingers. It felt like holding the beating heart of something they thought they already owned. I didn't open it yet. Not here. Not standing in the dust and shadows of the bedroom. This wasn't something you read in passing. This was something you prepared for. The next morning, I walked into the office of Mr. Keller, the same attorney who had once helped Grandma settle a zoning dispute for the shop. His office smelled faintly of leather and coffee, lined with books whose spines had been worn down by years of careful hands. I placed the leather folder on his desk. He adjusted his glasses, untied the ribbon around the documents, and began reading in silence. His eyes moved slowly, deliberately, like a man double-checking the weight of every word. When he finally looked up, there was no hesitation in his voice. "Eliot, this isn't just a piece of paper. This is the trademark registration for Tran Tea Company, the legal identity of the brand." I leaned forward, and he tapped the certificate with one finger. Under federal law, whoever possesses the original registration and supporting documents is the owner of the trademark. Without your consent, they can't use the name in commerce. Not on packaging, not in marketing, not even on the sign above the door. The words landed hard. "They own the buildings, the equipment, the tea," he continued. "But without this trademark, they can't call it Tran Tea. The name is the reputation. Without it, they're just selling leaves." I sat back, the truth settling in. In that conference room yesterday, they thought the will had erased me. But this meant they couldn't take a single step forward without my signature. "What happens," I asked, "if they try anyway?" His mouth curved in something between a smile and a warning. "That would be trademark infringement, civil damages, possible injunctions. In short, they'd bleed money before the first shipment left the warehouse." I closed the folder slowly. Grandma hadn't given me a seat at their table. She'd given me the table. By the time I left his office, I already knew exactly where I'd be going next, and exactly whose faces I wanted to see when I got there. 2 days later, I walked into Tran Tea Company's conference room without an invitation. The glass doors swung open to the sight of my father, my aunt, and my uncle seated around the polished mahogany table, papers spread out in neat stacks, expansion proposals, overseas contracts, marketing mock-ups. At the far end sat their corporate lawyer, mid-sentence about protecting the brand in emerging markets. No one noticed me at first. The room was all polished voices and the scratch of pens against paper, until I set the leather folder in the dead center of the table. The sound of it hitting the wood was enough to stop the meeting cold. My father looked up first, his expression sliding from surprise to irritation. "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer. I just pushed the folder toward their lawyer. He frowned, flipped it open, and began to read. The silence that followed was different this time, not awkward, not pitying, but sharp, like everyone was waiting for the punchline to a joke they didn't understand. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Under federal trademark law, this document supersedes any transfer stated in the will. Without Mr. Eliot Tran's consent, you cannot use the Tran Tea name in commerce." My aunt's pen slipped from her fingers. My uncle leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. My father's voice hardened. "You think you can hold us hostage with a piece of paper?" I met his stare. "I think I'm protecting what Grandma built. The name means something. She trusted me with it, not you." My aunt recovered first, leaning forward with her best imitation of diplomacy. "Eliot, we can work something out, a percentage, a cut." I shook my head. "No cuts, no deals. Every product, every ad, every contract that carries the Tran Tea name goes through me first. My signature, my approval, no exceptions." The corporate lawyer glanced between us. "Legally, he's correct. Any use of the trademark without licensing from Mr. Tran would be infringement. The penalties would be significant." My uncle exhaled slowly, looking at the table instead of me. "What's your plan, then?" I leaned back in my chair, the one at the head of the table, and let the weight of the moment hang in the air. "We scale back, focus on quality, no reckless expansions. And if you can't agree, you'll need a new name for your tea." No one agreed out loud. They didn't have to. The way my father's eyes dropped to his notes, the way my aunt clasped her hands together, the way my uncle slowly closed the folder in front of him, it was enough. The meeting dissolved without another word. Chairs scraped back, papers were gathered in hurried stacks, and one by one they filed out of the room. I stayed seated, hands resting on the leather folder until the last door closed. And for the first time in years, the head of the table felt like it belonged to me. In the days that followed, the phone stayed silent. No calls from my father, no half-hearted invitations from my aunt, not even the usual, just checking in texts from my uncle. It was as if I'd stepped off the family tree entirely, but I realized I'd been standing on my own branch for years. Inside the company, though, word traveled fast. Employees who'd been there since Grandma's time stopped me in the hallway, shook my hand, or gave a quick nod of respect. One of them, Mr. Han, who had managed the blending room for 3 decades, simply said, "She'd be proud," before walking away. That was enough. I made my first change quietly, a halt on the overseas expansion that had been draining resources. The return of a classic tin design that customers had been asking for since the early 90s. And, starting next month, a line of limited blends, each one named after a story Grandma used to tell me over tea. On a cold Friday evening, I stood across the street from the original Tran Tea shop. The lights inside were warm, casting a golden glow onto the sidewalk. Customers drifted in and out, clutching paper bags stamped with our logo. I traced the sign with my eyes, Tran Tea Co, and felt something settle in my chest. Not triumph, not revenge, just the quiet certainty that the name still meant what it was supposed to mean. She hadn't left me out of the will. She'd left me the one thing they couldn't buy, sell, or steal, the right to protect her legacy. And I intend to guard it for as long as the Tran name lives.